Welcome to the first episode where I talk to myself in my workshop. It's a strange time in the world, and I know a lot of people are really hurting and suffering financially and obviously with their health. But I'm still here making stuff, and I think a lot of people are probably going into their workshops to mess around with stuff because, you know, we have a bit more free time than we used to. I'm going to make some simple projects, nothing too daunting, but, you know, some things that I find really useful in my shop. What I really wanted to jump into today was this Dado Sled. There are hundreds of these. There's a bunch of different ways to make them, but I just thought I'd go through the one that I've been using for a while. I've kind of changed the design as I've gone along, and, you know, overall, I've been really happy with it, and it gets a lot of use. What it allows me to do is make things like this bookshelf here. Now, this one is just some film face birch ply. So that's why it's all black on the sides and plywood on the center, but this Dado jig works beautifully for solid timber. This was constructed using 5mm dados that are 18mm wide, so they fit the ply exactly. And I think the beauty of this jig is it allows you to do shelves of different depths just by modifying it slightly. So we'll jump into some of the features. The main body of this jig is this bed here. Now, I've made this out of some deco ply, which is like a melamine faced birch ply, because I had it lying around. It's nice and slippery. You could absolutely use any other melamine or some MDF or just something that you can give a fairly low friction surface to. There are these two rails essentially on either side of this bed, and that's what actually allows the router to travel back and forth without moving from side to side. I've designed this specifically to take this base plate, which is just some, 6 or 7mm plywood that I've stuck on the bottom of my router. You could absolutely design the sled to fit the circular base of your router exactly, but I find that I really like having the square edges. I think it slides a little better. It also allows me to use different routers that I have in this same jig just by changing this base plate over. The other thing that's really important to notice is my rails on here, one is red and one is white. And on the base plate that I'm using, I've also marked a red side and a non-marked side. And that's because I always want to make sure that this plate is sitting within the sled in exactly the same way. That means that, like, when I've mounted that plate, if it's slightly to one side or the other, I'm not constantly enlarging the hole in the center of the sled by, putting this plate in the wrong way around. I think that's a really simple trick to make sure that your dados are always lining up in exactly the right place. In terms of construction, you're going to want to start with this main bed before you add any of these reference fences in. So set your fences here that guide the router base, and then you're actually going to cut that dado with the router in this jig before you've added any of these things here. What that means is that it's going to be in exactly the right place. You can use the walls of the dado that you've cut in your jig to mark exactly where the dado is going to be in your work. Also, when you go to add on these guide arms, which are what references the timber, you can actually square them against the dado itself, which is the line that you're actually going to be cutting, rather than the jig, which, in my case, I don't know if these are exactly square here, but I know that this fence is square to this dado here. I initially created this jig for a shelf that was 600mm deep, so that's why this is my primary reference fence, and then the secondary one out here is around 600mm apart. But this little shelf that I've done recently is only 150mm deep, so I've added this second supplementary fence, which I've just screwed on, and that allowed me to put both of those 150mm wide pieces in together and cut them at the same time. In fact, before I even split those pieces down the center. So I started with a 300 wide piece, I cut all the dados, and then I took it to the table saw and ripped it down the center into my two side pieces. I find the best way to use this jig for me is to mark out where I want those dados on my stock. So in the case of this giant bookshelf, I marked them the whole way along. Now, there are some other ways of doing this, but I just like to know that it's in the right place every time. So I'm just going to mark that out on this test piece here. And then you can go and place your jig onto the workpiece, making sure that you've lined up the line that you've just drawn with the edge of the dado that is cut in the jig. Now, I personally find it useful to mark both sides of my dado in my work so that I know I'm cutting that dado on the correct side of the line or in between the lines, and that makes sure that I don't mess it up. So just give it a tap to get it into position. Usually, obviously, I would be working on a much longer piece, but for the sake of this demonstration, I've just grabbed this short piece here. In order to clamp this jig to the workpiece, I usually apply pressure to these rails which sit on either side of the timber into the work itself. I like to do it on both sides, and I find that adds plenty of pressure to make sure it's not going to move. When you've got your jig in position and you've clamped it to your workpiece, you might find that you need to stop the workpiece from moving around the table as you make those cuts. Sometimes, if I've got a long piece, I can just put something really heavy on it and it stops it from moving around. Rubber mats or carpet underneath on your work table also really helps prevent a ton of movement. You could absolutely clamp the workpiece down to the table as well if you need to. With the jig all clamped in place and in the correct location, you're ready to do the dado itself. Now, setting the depth of the dado, you've got to keep in mind that you've also got to incorporate the thickness of your jig. I like to keep the material that I've used to make my jig as thin as possible. So in this case, it's 10 mil thick, or a little under ½ inch. I found that when I was using thicker stock, often I would need to extend the router bit too far, and that introduces problems like potentially needing to use a router bit extension, which I'd really like to avoid. So by keeping the stock of the jig really thin, I'm able to minimize the extension that I've got to push the router bit out. So I want these dados to be 5 mil deep. My base plate here is 10.6 mil thick, so the measurement on my router is 10.6 plus 5. I'm able to set that on the router first, and then I do a test cut. I check the depth on my actual workpiece with a caliper to make sure that it's correct, make any adjustments I need to, and then I can do the cut. This is the dado I just cut, and I checked it with my calipers. It sits at just below 5 mil deep, which is right for what I'm doing. And that means that I could then take the jig onto my actual workpiece, mark all of those dado cuts out, and then just go through one by one and cut them. Make sure that you've got something that slides cleanly and you're not building up a whole bunch of sawdust under there as you go along. Another thing to think about is if you were doing all of these dados at a very specific distance from each other, like I did with this shelf here, there would be a way to add a reference stop to the jig itself, maybe something that was movable. So you make the first cut, and then as you move along, the reference stop, so just a little piece of material of the same thickness of the dado that you're cutting, slides into that hole, and that references your second cut. As you move it along, that little block slides into the second hole. There are some finger jointing jigs and box jointing jigs for table saws that work in this way. When I cut these, I just marked them and cut them, but it did occur to me that that might speed things up. That's something to keep in mind. I like to wax these as well as waxing the base of my router itself. The wax does sometimes accumulate sawdust, so I know that there are other products that people might prefer to use, but I have found that as long as I keep this clean, it works really well. You don't want to introduce a whole bunch of additional friction into the system because that tends to also introduce inaccuracy as well. That's it for this jig today. I hope you got something out of it. I hope to do a whole lot more of these videos, just short projects, keeping you up to date with what's going on in my workshop. These are great.